Alright guys, Dominic here for Kit Guru, and regular viewers will know I absolutely love a good old GPU revisit. So that is exactly what we're going to do today with this video sponsored by Gigabyte. We're going to see exactly how well AMD's RDNA 1 GPUs have aged since their launch back in 2019 by stacking up the 5700 and 5700 XT against three RDNA 4 based Gigabyte cards. Is it finally time to upgrade if you're still hanging on to one of those OG RDNA GPUs? Let's find out today. Today's mission then is very simple. We're going to be taking two of the very first AMD RDNA 1 GPUs that launched all the way back in 2019 in the form of the RX 5700 and 5700 XT, and we're going to compare them against three of AMD's latest and greatest using the RX 9060 XT, the 9070 and the 9070 XT, which are all, of course, RDNA 4 GPUs. Specifically for the RX 9000 series, we have three of Gigabyte's gaming OC models, so all from the same family, and as such, the designs are very similar. They all sport these dark grey shrouds that have a nice textured look, which I have to say looks very good to my eye, while there's lighter grey metal backplates on each model with a cutout towards the end to allow for extra airflow. Both the 9070 and 9070 XT do offer dual BIOS as well, while they have a pair of HDMI 2.1 ports and DisplayPort 2.1 ports, whereas the 9060 XT cuts back on just one of those HDMI connectors. That 9060 XT though only requires a single 8-pin power connector with two on the 9070 and three on the 9070 XT, but there's no 12V high power in sight. Overall, it's certainly safe to say these are three very solid looking cards, so it's time to take a look and find out exactly how they perform when stacked up against their RDNA 1 counterparts. We're going to be comparing them when it comes to both rasterization performance, but also looking at ray tracing and FSR. To do this, we're going to be using our regular GPU test system, which is packing in the Ryzen 7 9800X3D with an X870E motherboard, and we've also got 64GB of DDR5 memory running at CL30 latency. Instead of just showing a bunch of charts though, we're actually going to start off each section by looking at some gameplay capture of each of the cards, looking primarily at the 1440p and 4K data, though we have used slightly different image quality settings for each game depending on what makes sense. We're not going to be looking at ray tracing or upscaling in this section though, as that will come later. And once we have shown the gameplay capture, we do still have our regular charts all formatted in the same way, just to give you a quick and easy way to digest all of that data. With all of that said then, let's go ahead and dive into our first game. Up first then, we have Call of Duty Black Ops 6 using the multiplayer benchmark, and this is using the Ultra preset, so one step down from max settings. Even at 1440p, this is a struggle for the 5700 as it's barely hitting 30 FPS, and with the 1% lows dropping lower still, whereas the 9060 XT is managing at least 60 FPS, but oftentimes well higher. Then we bring in the 5700 XT, which isn't much better than its smaller RDNA 1 sibling, as it's still struggling to exceed 40 FPS, whereas the RX 9070 is looking well over twice as fast in this section of the bench. If we step up to 4K though, using the 5700 XT and the 9070 XT for comparison, you can clearly see that this resolution is just not going to work on the RDNA 1 GPUs, whereas the RDNA 4 flagship makes relatively light work of the benchmark, and remember, this is without any FSR upscaling too. Averaged over the course of the benchmark then, at 1440p we can see a clear gulf in class between these GPUs. Even the 9060 XT is almost twice as fast as the 5700 XT, whereas the 9070 XT tops the chart, averaging just under 130 FPS. At 4K, things do get more challenging, and the 9060 XT isn't really primed for that resolution, at least not without something like FSR performance mode, but both the 9070 and 9070 XT average well over 60 FPS. Next up then, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and despite this game coming out just 1 year after the launch of RDNA 1, the 5700 cannot cope with 1440p using ultra settings and immediately drops to below 30 FPS in our combat sequence. Even the 5700 XT won't keep the 1% lows above 30 FPS, whereas the 9060 XT is hitting close to 60 frames per second at all times. Swap in the RX 9070 as well, and that gets closer to 100 FPS, so you can really see a huge leap in performance versus RDNA 1. Naturally, that means you won't even be thinking about 4K res on the 5700 XT at these settings, whereas the 9070 XT is delivering a fairly smooth 60 FPS. Yeah, there are some dips here and there depending on exactly what's happening on screen, but it is clearly a night and day difference. Bringing up the chart for 1440p then, neither RDNA 1 GPU can keep the 1% lows above 30 FPS, whereas we can see the 9060 XT averaging 66 frames per second, with the 9070 and 9070 XT both over 100 FPS on average. 4K sees the 9070 XT averaging 60 FPS exactly, which is not a bad place to be without any upscaling, and likewise the 9070 would be perfectly playable with even FSR quality mode if you are happy to enable that. Moving on though to Forza Horizon 5. Now this is an incredibly well optimized game, so at 1440p the RX 5700 is looking in much better shape. But it's still not much above 40 FPS using the highest in-game preset, whereas the 9060 XT holds very steady at well over 100 FPS on average, with significantly lower PC latency too. Swapping in the 5700 XT does help RDNA 1 a bit, and it is closer to 60 FPS now, but we also see another big jump in performance going from the 9060 XT to the 9070, boosting frame rates and reducing latency further. If you want to game at 4K, the good news is that both the 9070 and the 9070 XT are great candidates in Forza Horizon 5. During my testing, the 5700 XT actually got a notification about low VRAM allocation here, which isn't surprising considering the 8GB buffer, whereas both 16GB RDNA 4 GPUs were pushing well over 120 FPS, with the 9070 XT another 10% or so ahead of the regular 9070. Confirming those results then, we have the 1440p chart, and 59 FPS isn't atrocious for the 5700 XT by any means, but it's less than half of the performance of even the 9060 XT, and it's about a third of the 9070 XT. Meanwhile, the 9060 XT is still very viable for 4K gaming in this title, though the 9070 and 9070 XT do deliver that next step up, both averaging around the 120 to 130 FPS mark respectively. From one Horizon to another, as we're looking at Horizon Forbidden West, 1440p is again too much for the 5700, so I've actually skipped to the 5700 XT, which still can't keep above 30 FPS at all times using the very high preset. The 9060 XT is pretty much locked in at 60 FPS in this test area around Plainsong, though the 9070 takes the upper notch and hits around 90 FPS, which isn't bad at all considering all the particle effects in this scene, which really can tank GPU performance. Naturally, those results mean that RDNA 1 GPUs will not fare well at 4K resolution, where you'd really want the 9070 XT for smoothest performance, given it hits around 60 FPS, but with some variation both above and below that figure. So it's another title where FSR would come into its own, but more on that later. Averaged over the bench then, at 1440p, neither RDNA 1 GPU managed 30 FPS on average, let alone the 1% lows, whereas the 9060 XT hit 60 FPS average right on the nose, while the 9070 and 9070 XT were up around 90 to 100 FPS. As we mentioned, 4K is much tougher, and the 9070 XT is the only one that managed to keep the average frame rates above 60 frames per second, though again, FSR would play very nicely with both that GPU and the regular 9070 for smoother performance. Despite being another highly performant game, there's something about Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 that doesn't play very well on RDNA 1 GPUs, and even the RX 5700 XT is not playable at 1440p using the Ultra preset, whereas the 9060 XT is sitting just below that 60 FPS figure. The 9070 does improve on that a good chunk, hitting around 80 FPS or just below in the more demanding area of the benchmark, but it is still very playable for this type of game. That has knock-on effects for 4K resolution too, where the 5700 XT absolutely crumples, and things are still a bit tough for even the 9070 XT, where it's around 50 FPS on average with some variation here or there depending on the exact area of the game. Another title where FSR would pair very nicely for higher frame rates then. Confirming things with the 1440p chart, the 5700 XT doesn't keep the 1% lows above 30 FPS at all times, though the 9060 XT is a near 60 FPS lock, with the 9070 XT coming in just shy of 100 FPS. As mentioned, 4K is significantly tougher, and you can see that in the chart, though it is still a very near 60 FPS lock for the 9070 XT, but don't even think about this resolution if you're still hanging on to a first-gen RDNA GPU. Next then is Marvel Rivals, and even using the medium preset at 1440p, it's a lot more demanding than I would have thought considering it's a competitive title. The 5700 for instance dips below 30 FPS, and the 5700 XT doesn't hold that much smoother overall. Now, the 9060 XT does deliver better performance at around the 60 FPS mark in this first segment of the benchmark, though you'd probably want something more like a 9070, which is hitting around that 90 to 100 FPS mark as we move into the second segment of the benchmark. Again, given the type of game it is, I'm not sure how many people will be playing at 4K, but at medium settings we're looking at around 60 FPS from the 9070 XT, so it is light years ahead of the 5700 XT, but would definitely still benefit from some image quality tweaks to boost frame rates even higher. Bringing up the 1440p chart then confirms that you need at least the 9060 XT for 60 FPS at medium settings, but a 9070 to exceed 100 FPS, whereas 4K, as we mentioned, is a much sterner test, and the 9070 XT is really the GPU that you'd want even at medium settings. For any Starfield lovers out there, you'll also be wanting to aim well above these RDNA 1 GPUs, given the 5700 XT barely holds around 30 FPS at 1440p using ultra settings. The 9060 XT isn't far off double that performance, being in the mid 50 FPS range, but again, the 9070 provides that bit of extra grunt to ensure you're always above 60 and more like in the 80 FPS region. If you're playing at 4K too, Starfield is definitely another contender where you'd likely want to enable FSR, given we're looking at about 60 FPS for the 9070 XT, but the 1% lows do drop down below that mark. Confirming those results then with the 1440p chart, there's a clear hierarchy on show, with the 9060 XT well clear of the 5700 XT, though the 9070 is much faster still at 80 FPS on average, with the 9070 XT sitting top on 93 FPS. 4K really does push the limits without upscaling, and the 9070 XT averages just below 60 FPS, but with the 1% lows hitting 55 FPS, so it's still about 15 to 20% faster than the 9070 non-XT. Lastly then, we have Star Wars Jedi Survivor, and this is another game that exposes the issue with the 5700 and 5700 XT, given their 8GB frame buffers. Most of the game's textures just don't load in at any sort of quality, resulting in it looking like a blurry mess, even at 1440p, whereas the RDNA 4 GPUs are pin sharp and very performant overall, with even the 9060 XT delivering a solid 60 frames per second. Naturally, the same goes at 4K, but performance also drops off significantly for RDNA 1, rendering it completely unplayable. The 9070 XT is RDNA 4's best bet here, delivering close to 60 FPS at all times, though again FSR would come in handy for a smoother frame rate. Rounding out those results with the 1440p chart shows very respectable performance from the RDNA 4 GPUs, and it also shows that sometimes bar charts don't tell the whole story, given the RDNA 1 GPUs were missing those textures. Likewise, at 4K, the 9070 XT stretches its legs and shows why it is the fastest GPU AMD currently offers. That is it though for our look at rasterization performance, and now it's time to move on to ray tracing. Of course, you're probably watching this thinking that RDNA 1 GPUs don't even support hardware accelerated ray tracing, and that is absolutely correct, so that's another area where they're really showing their age in 2025. For my comparisons then, I've actually brought in the RX 6800 XT, which was RDNA 2, which was the first AMD GPU architecture to support hardware accelerated ray tracing, and it's also a rough price equivalent to the 9070 XT, so that's what I'm going to be using for these comparisons at 1440p resolution. Starting off with Cyberpunk then, using the built-in benchmark, this is 1440p using ultra ray tracing and the FSR quality mode. Straight away we can see a huge leap forward for the 9070 XT, given it's over twice as fast as the 6800 XT in the initial sequence, and is delivering very playable frame rates at around 80 to 90 FPS, so not bad at all considering the image quality on offer. The 9070 XT is even capable of some path tracing in Doom the Dark Ages, where we're running the Ultra preset, path tracing on, and FSR quality mode at 1440p. Now, it could be a higher frame rate at around 60 FPS, but again, it's still twice as fast as the 6800 XT here, and delivers playable gaming using path tracing on an AMD GPU, which is not something you would have said about even RDNA 3. We're also taking a look at Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, where at 1440p using very high ray tracing and FSR quality mode, we're once again looking at roughly a 2x improvement for the 9070 XT over the 6800 XT, which is not bad at all for a 2-generation jump, with the 9070 XT hovering around 120 FPS, making it very playable at high levels of fidelity. Speaking of fidelity, Ratchet & Clank is a great example of the benefits of FSR 4. As we know, FSR4 launched with the RDNA 4 family back in March, and it uses machine learning for the first time, and that delivers huge improvements in image quality over FSR3. We can see that in multiple instances, be it the much cleaner or artifact-free rendering of these holograms here, or by the lack of sizzling and distortion around those booster flames in this shot here, and simply by how much less garbled and jumbled up all the confetti looks in this confetti shooter thing here. It's also so much more stable in motion with loads less fizzling, so it really does show the improvements made here, and as a reminder, FSR4 is currently an exclusive to the RDNA 4 series. That brings us on to the end of this video then, and as you probably guessed from the outset, AMD's gaming GPUs have come a long way since the launch of RDNA 1 back in 2019. If you are still hanging on to one of those original RDNA GPUs, the 3 Gigabyte cards we've looked at today with the 9060 XT, 9070 and 9070 XT all promise significantly higher frame rates for 1440p or even 4K gaming, while ray tracing is also leaps and bounds better than even RDNA 2. As we've just seen as well, the RDNA 4 exclusive FSR4 upscaling has also come on hugely and really is a massive improvement over even FSR 3.1, so that is another thing to keep in mind. If you are interested in one of these 3 Gigabyte cards, I am going to leave a link down in the description below, but that is really it for this video. Just before I go though, I do want to hear from you guys. What GPU are you currently rocking and how long are you hoping to keep it for? Do let me know down in the comments below. While there, please do subscribe, and if you haven't already, be sure to ding that notification bell. If you want to carry on the conversation as well, you find a link to our Discord server in the description, and while there, you'll also find links to both our merch store and our Patreon if you want to help us out that way. That's it for this one though, guys. I'm Dominic the Kit Guru, and I'll see you in the next video.